if we're going to defend the idea, and again, there is no wrong answer here, right? You get to decide whether you're going to give up your right protected under the Fourth Amendment. There's no wrong answer here. You decide. You have protections under the Fourth Amendment. You have protections under the First Amendment. You have protection under the Fifth Amendment, right? There is no wrong answer. You get to decide whether you're going to give up those liberties. But what I'm suggesting is unless people start standing a little bit firmer, it's just going to get more and more difficult. Because right now we have a government that's just okay. And we have a citizenry that's just okay. But here's the interesting thing. Do you remember when all of this stuff came down with Edward Snowden? Edward Snowden came down and revealed a lot of information that was going on. I maintain he's a hero. And I know there's a lot of disagreement even among conservative circles as to what he actually did and whether he hurt us or harmed us. I maintain that he is a hero and he will be classified as a hero in generations to come. There's no question in my mind. But with that being said, you remember when Lindsey Graham came on TV shortly after all of this was disclosed with Edward Snowden coming out and giving up this information. He's on an interview. It was Fox News or MSNBC, I don't remember. But he said this. He says, I have nothing to hide. I have no problem with the government collecting my information. I have no problem with them collecting the data on my phone calls and the duration of those phone calls. I have no problem with it because I'm not talking to terrorists, and I know you're not talking to terrorists. And if me and you aren't talking to terrorists, we aren't doing something wrong, so we have nothing to hide. And I remember showing that clip on the very day after he made that statement in my college classroom. And the overwhelming majority of my students agreed with him. They agreed with him. Just intuitively. I mean, there was no really thinking through what it was that he said. It was just, I have nothing to hide. And apparently, if you have nothing to hide, well, then you allow government to freely search. Isn't it interesting that an individual who says, I'm talking from the broader perspective, I have nothing to hide, therefore let government search, really they're claiming that there are two different types of people. There are bad people that do really bad things, that commit murder, that do all of those things, and then there's people that live pretty boring lives. Now think about this. For a person to say that I have nothing to hide, I'm not just talking about the search of a car, I'm talking about from a very broad perspective. For a person to say, I have nothing to hide, it really is an extreme self-deprecating statement. In other words, my life is so boring and uninteresting that there's nothing I could possibly do that I want to hide from anyone else. It's impossible. Think about this. This is so powerful, guys. This is how I convince my students just making an argument here. Wait a second. You're telling me you have nothing to hide? I have nothing to hide. Really? I've got an email address, and I'd like you to write down on this piece of paper some things for me. I would like your email address, sign in and log in, and username, your username and password. And would you be willing to do that? Right? Same thing with your username and password on your social media accounts. Would you be willing to do that? Of course not. Why? Because there are certain things that they want to protect. Same thing with, it's the very reason that all of us do certain things that we do want to be left alone. Intuitively, we understand the right of privacy. But apparently when we're talking about government protecting us, we lose all sense of reality. But why do you put locks on your doors? Because you want to be left alone. Why do you put curtains up on in your home? Because you want to be left alone. There are certain things that all of us do where we truly do not want other people to know. It doesn't mean we're criminals. It simply means that we do not want to disclose that information. Right? You would go to an individual and say you're involved in a lawsuit. You might tell your attorney information that you wouldn't come up here and tell us. Many of us are married. There are things that we tell our spouses that we would never get up and tell anybody else. Right? There are things that we would tell our bishops or our pastors that we would never tell anybody else. There are things that we would tell a psychologist that we would never disclose to anybody else. Why? Do we have something to hide? Are we criminals? No. The Fourth Amendment is not designed to protect just individuals who have done something wrong. It's deeper than that. It's designed to protect your right and my right to be left alone, to decide when we're going to disclose the information. We get to decide. And so when we say that I have nothing to hide, we're really giving in to something that I think is a fallacy. Because we do have things we want to hide. We do want to be left alone. All of us do it. Right? No, I bet there's very few of you that would say, yeah, everybody can sift through my wallet, just pass around the wallet. Right? To see what's in your purse. Pass around the purses. We're going to share with one another and see what's in. We wouldn't do that. Not because we have anything that's criminal in those things, but because we don't want other people to search through those things. See, here's what's going on in America today. When you think about Rand Paul and the argument was making, I thought it was fascinating to listen to him. And I thought it was fascinating to watch the Republicans, some of your mainstream establishment Republicans, try and counter this guy. I mean, to the point where Senator McCain is no longer wanting to have the tit-for-tat argument, but is now accusing Rand Paul of not understanding the rules on the floor. Right? That's where we go. When you have no argument, when you have no substance, you accuse the individual of not knowing the rules. Listen, Rand Paul knows the rules probably better than any of those guys. I don't care how long McCain's been there. I would put he was awesome. So, but think about this. We are becoming a surveillance state, aren't we? So think about this. When I go on to college campuses, I'll ask questions like, do you have a problem with video cameras up on our streets? Most people say no. No, I have no problem with that. But why not? Well, because when you step out in the public, you lose your right of privacy. That's a bunch of nonsense. You can be out in the general public, and there are many circumstances where you still maintain your right of privacy. Would you be okay with having audio devices along all of our public streets, listening to our conversations, and government deciding when they're going to listen in on those conversations and when they're not? Of course not. But here's what's going on. This idea of collecting the data from our phone records is really an opportunity to control the people. Cameras on the streets are an opportunity to control the people. Right? We keep saying that if we have this surveillance state, we're going to stop things like the Boston bombing. We're going to stop with the collection of the phone records. We're going to stop things like Benghazi. Right? These things are still happening. Right? Massacres are still happening. These things are purely reactive. They're not proactive. So have any of you heard, you remember Jeremy Bentham of the 18th century? Jeremy Bentham. He came up with this idea of what's called the panopticon. This is fascinating. The panopticon. Anybody familiar with this idea? The idea was that you could build a prison yard and you could build a tower in the middle of the prison yard. And you could control the people even when nobody was in the tower. Because you couldn't see into the tower, but they could see out. So at any given time, you could have a person in the tower looking in one direction, but not able to look in every direction. And because the prisoners couldn't see in, they never knew whether they were being observed or not. What happened? As a result of the way that it was structured, the individual always had the sense that he was being watched. What happens when you start to allow for a state where we have cameras up everywhere? You start to have the sense that you're being watched. Now, are there things that you might not do in general public if you knew you were being watched? Yeah, you may not commit crimes, but there are a lot of other things that you might not do, right? Maybe dancing on the streets. Right? Maybe doing some other things, maybe being affectionate with your spouse, right? Why wouldn't you do some of those things? Because many of us are afraid of shame, ridicule, and embarrassment. So we might not do certain things knowing that what we are doing might be disclosed to the public. I mean, we see things on Facebook all the time where an individual's at a concert, he's at a party, and somebody films them dancing, and they look like an absolute fool. If they knew that they were being recorded, do you think that they would have danced? Most of them would say no, because they didn't want to experience the shame or ridicule. My point is, the idea of a surveillance state is not just going after the bad guy. It's going after all of us. It's stopping us from doing things that we otherwise might do. And so when you look at a guy like Rand Paul, when he went after what we saw this last week, hero, absolute hero. He was the lone voice in the wilderness. Think about this. John Adams said this. John Adams says, if you are in the majority, it's time to take a second look. Why? Because the majority, the mob, generally gets it wrong. That's why I love watching Paul and Cruz and Lee do their work. Because they're not running with the majority. Right? They're running against the majority, and the overwhelming majority of the time, they're right. They're right. It's the majority that are wrong. It's the mob that's wrong. Why? Because what does the mob want? The mob wants to maintain their position of power, right? And the mob is telling the rest of the country that we're looking out for you. We want to protect you, and the mob believes it. When in reality, all they're concerned about is two things, as Thomas Sowell said, elections and re-elections.